Look, I want to discuss the concept of agribusiness. That includes agriculture and grazing, which are the two main forms of agriculture. Agribusiness, agriculture and grazing. Now, a lot of people think that agribusiness is a relatively new concept, but the fact is, it isn't. Agribusiness was a foundation, cornerstone of the colonial exploitation of Australia. Let's not forget that once the British Crown occupied the east coast of Australia on behalf of the British monarchy, that they were followed very rapidly by people who had positions of authority and institutional power in England. And within a few years, after the original inhabitants had been dispersed in the most brutal manner, what we saw is the land was dominated what was described as the squatocracy. Now, squatters aren't, as we're led to imagine, poor people who've come and claimed land. In the majority of cases, squatters, and let's not forget that by 1850, 700 squatters in Victoria had squatted the whole of Victoria. 700. Now, most of these were financed from England, and this finance was basically given to them to exploit the land, to grow sheep, to send wool to the industrial mills at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. So most of these people were gentry, in inverted commas, people who lived by exploiting other people's labour. So agribusiness is a foundation stone of this country. Now, what happened after the Eureka Rebellion in 1854 is that because the number of people had increased dramatically, transportation of convicts had ceased on the east coast of Australia, the population began to grow, that people clamoured for land. And it's quite interesting that over the next 50 to 60 years in this country, both in the east and west coast, the north and the south, we saw competition for land, from land which had been stolen from the original inhabitants, grow between the squatocracy and ordinary people who were moving away from gold mining to agriculture and grazing. And it's important to remember that one of the first reforms after the Eureka Rebellion in 1855 was the sale of land to people, small plots of land. Now, after the 1854 rebellion at Ballarat, there were two parliaments. There was the parliament where we know in Spring Street, which was based on representative democracy, and there was an alternative parliament less than 100 metres away at the Eastern Markets, the Victorian Land Convention, which was based on a delegate system. And for the next 10 years, both parliaments struggled for power. Ultimately, the representative democracy won. But during that period, legislation was passed not just in Victoria but other colonies, which allowed ordinary people to acquire land which had been stolen from the original inhabitants. And that's the key: acquire land from the Crown. So we then saw the proliferation of small farmers around the country, but the squatocracy, especially in Northern Australia and West Australia and large parts of New South Wales continued to dominate agriculture, and they relied on cheap labour. This was an era which was non-mechanised, and in order to till the land, grow sheep and cattle, you needed cheap labour. Initially this cheap labour was provided by ticket of leave men and women, that's convicts who'd finished their sentence, who are on a probationary system, and they could be employed for relatively nothing. As the convict system ceased, the ticket of leave men and women dried up, we saw the creation of a working class in this country, and that working class was not just involved in business and industry, but a significant proportion of the Australian population was involved in agriculture as wage slaves. And the great strike wave of 1891 and 1892 across the east coast of Australia, which led to the formation of the Australian Labor Party, was a revolt by waged labourers. And all the songs and poems about swagmen and waltzing Matilda during that period highlighted the itinerant and difficult nature of life as an agricultural labourer. As North Australia opened up, the problem of labour became acute. People with resources who had acquired land needed labour to grow sugarcane and other crops, because there was a huge market for sugar in the British Empire. So they resolved that problem by a system called blackbirding. What happened, ships would go out into the near Pacific, Tonga, the Marshall Islands, Noumea, Vanuatu, and the list goes on. And young men and women would be kidnapped and taken to the New South Wales, northern New South Wales cane fields and the Queensland cane fields, and basically used as slave labour. These were commonly called the kanaks. And interestingly, when Federation was formed on the 1st of January 1901, one of the original pieces of legislation, the White Australia Policy, which was the first piece of legislation passed by the Australian Parliament, was centred around the question of the kanak problem, in inverted commas. And over the next 3 to 4 years, over 25,000 people, kanaks who had lived here for decades, were deported back to the islands. So the problem of labour became acute during World War I, because from a population of 5 million, 420,000 young men volunteered to fight for God, King and Country in a war fought by workers at either end of a bayonet. And over 62,000 died, another 60,000 died within 10 years returning to Australia. So the shortage of labour was acute. So the way the government attempted to resolve this problem is by creating soldier settlements. These were basically plots of land, small plots, relatively small plots, given to returned servicemen to expand the agricultural sector, not the grazing sector, but the agricultural sector. Unfortunately, most of this land was marginal because those who owned land were unwilling to sacrifice a few acres for the returned servicemen. And most of these soldier settlements ended in dire poverty and failed. So, at the beginning of the 20th century, agriculture was dominated by small farmers, and the grazing sector was dominated by large corporations, agribusiness, most of them owned from England, There was one station in Northern Australia bigger than the whole of England and Scotland combined. And these stations relied on unpaid, that's right, unpaid Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander labour to expand and survive. And it wasn't until the mid-60s until the Gurindji went out on strike with the assistance of the Communist Party of Australia, that system of not paying Aboriginal workers ended. So we had these multiple small farmers. Obviously they found it difficult to survive in the economic climate, and we saw an interesting phenomenon. We saw the creation of collectives and mutual societies among different farming groups which were involved in different forms of agriculture. Dairy was one of the main ones which was mutualised, collectivised. We saw even the grazing industry, the wool industry. And at that particular time, the Country Party of Australia, which morphed into the National Party, at that particular time, the Country Party of Australia had a very strong policy regarding ensuring that farmers, especially small farmers who provided its electoral base, were protected through collectivisation, through the formation of collectives and the formation of standard prices. Now what happened with mechanisation? The whole character of agriculture, and to a lesser degree grazing industry, changed. Mechanisation meant you didn't need labour, but you needed capital in order to buy machinery. And what we saw is the large numbers of people involved in agriculture, and to a lesser degree the grazing industry, drift back to the cities to work in the emerging and expanding industrial sector. So with mechanisation came a new problem for farmers, especially small farmers. Not only did they have to find a market for their products, but more importantly, they had to pay. They were indebted to financial institutions and banks to buy the machinery which was required in order to keep up with changes in the agricultural sector. And in the 50s and 60s, we saw a significant proportion of farmers and graziers leave the agricultural industry because they were not able to finance, or they were bankrupted through the financial transactions they were forced to make. So what we saw is an expansion or a recreation of agribusiness. And when the Country Party was morphed into the National Party, we saw to a significant degree the end of small-scale farming in this country, although some continue to struggle. What was the pivotal moment in the 80s when the deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation revolution occurred in this country began? What we saw is the collectives that had been formed by farmers and the cooperatives, more importantly the cooperatives, which have been formed by farmers to market their products, and the idea of having a baseline price which allowed them to survive, and mutual societies, were all fair game for demutualisation, the breaking up of cooperatives, and unfortunately most small farmers, especially in the dairy sector, believe the propaganda that globalisation and privatisation, the breaking down of their cooperatives, a so-called free market, would actually improve their financial situation. The reality was very different. So what we've seen from the 1980s is the collapse to a significant degree of the agricultural sector. And to a significant degree, I'm talking about this today because of a survey which was recently released amongst 1,100 small farmers. And let's not forget that climate change is now having a significant impact on agriculture and grazing. And the floods and fires we've had over the last few years highlight to many farmers the precarious situation they find themselves in a private investment for private profit world, where we see the privatisation of this country's water. We see corporations and hedge funds manipulate the water market, which is critical for agriculture, in order to maximise their profits and destroy small farmers. And we hear constantly about small farmers being forced to sell up, close their farms down, and have them absorbed by these large corporations which to a significant degree rely on mechanisation. But on top of that, there has been another problem. For far too long, the farm workers which were required for certain types of farming and grazing have been paid a pittance. They're mainly non-unionised, part-time workers, and with COVID-19 pandemic, we saw even the larger farming corporations start bleating for labour. And we continue to have that issue as far as agriculture is concerned. So agribusiness is nothing new. What is new is the Country Party of Australia, which looked after small farmers, which promoted cooperatives, which promoted a baseline product price for products like milk and wool, has now become hostage to agribusiness, to the large corporations. And many small farmers are the small farmers that are left, and it's a rapidly shrinking minority, are beginning to understand their future does not lie with the National Party. And that's why we've seen the Farmers Fishers Party grow and even have representation at state level. So the reality is that agribusiness is nothing new. The wheel in the last 240 years has turned full circle. At the beginning, once the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population were removed in the most despicable way from their traditional lands and dispersed, the remnants were dispersed across the country, what we saw is a small number of people backed by financial institutions dominate agriculture. We then saw the rise of independent, small, what were described as yeoman farmers, and the Victorian Land Convention in the 1850s and 1860s highlighted that particular movement. We saw the rise of the power of agricultural workers, the formation of the Australian Labor Party, the deportation of the kanaks. And today we see agribusiness dominating almost every aspect of agriculture in this country. So what's the lesson for people? The lesson is very simple. Things change. They seem to change. But when you look at them closely, nothing has really changed. People have tried to make a living through agriculture and grazing. Many have been frozen out. Many have been bankrupted. Many face huge problems. And in a privatised, demutualised society, those problems will continue to increase, and they cannot be solved by a national party which represents agribusiness, not what remains of the small farming sector.